In the autumn of 1943, within the opulent halls of Hall, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring could afford a moment of satisfaction. The reports from the front were a testament to his Luftwaffe's invincibility. Just weeks earlier, during the raid on Schweinfurt, his fighter pilots had carved a bloody path through the American bomber formations. 60 B-17s, 60 10-man crews had been erased from the sky in a single afternoon. The message was clear. The industrial heart of the Third Reich was untouchable. Göring had long cultivated a theatrical contempt for his new enemy. The Americans can't build planes, he had once scoffed to his staff. They're good at making refrigerators and razor blades. This wasn't mere bluster, it was an article of faith. It was a belief in a superior German engineering culture, a martial spirit that could not be matched by a nation of shopkeepers. And the skies over Germany seemed to prove him right every single day. The American strategy of daylight bombing was, in his eyes, a suicidal act of arrogance. The confidence of the Luftwaffe High Command was not built on propaganda, but on physics. An invisible wall, more formidable than any fortress, protected Germany. It was a wall of distance and fuel consumption. Allied fighters, the P-47s and Spitfires, could only guard the bombers for the first few hundred miles. Then, their fuel gauges would dip towards empty, and they would be forced to turn back, leaving the heavy bombers to face the wolves alone. For Göring and his generals, this was not a temporary problem to be solved. It was a fundamental, unchangeable law of aerial warfare. But across the Atlantic, in the sprawling, clamorous factories of the American Midwest, and on windswept airfields in eastern England, a fundamentally different war was being waged. It was not a war of aristocratic aces and exquisitely engineered interceptors. It was a war of brute force problem solving, of industrial logic, of men who saw the Luftwaffe's defensive wall not as a tactical challenge, but as a plumbing problem. The question tormenting the U.S. 8th Air Force was not how to outfight a Messerschmitt, but simply how to get a fighter to the fight, 300, 400, 500 miles deep into enemy territory. The German solution to a technical problem was to invent a more perfect machine. The American solution was to invent a disposable gadget. And in this case, the gadget was the drop tank, a crude teardrop-shaped container of aluminum, or even more contemptibly, plastic impregnated paper bolted to the belly of a fighter. To a German engineer obsessed with performance, aerodynamics, and permanence, this was an ugly temporary fix. It was an admission that your aircraft's design was flawed. To an American logistician, it was genius. It was a recognition that the container for the fuel did not need to be as sophisticated as the engine that burned it. This philosophical chasm ran to the very materials of war. While German industry carefully husbanded its strategic reserves of aluminum to craft its drop tanks, planning for their recovery and reuse, British and American factories began churning out hundreds of thousands of tanks made from craft paper and casein glue derived from milk. They were designed not to be recovered, but to be discarded. Each one cost about $25. They were, in essence, disposable fuel cans that turned a medium-range escort fighter into a long-range predator. And once empty, they would be cast off, raining down on the German countryside, a shower of industrial contempt. This was a new kind of warfare, born not in a military academy, but on a Detroit assembly line. It was a system where the ingenuity of a technical officer like Colonel Cass Hauff, who personally flew terrifying high-altitude tests to ensure these makeshift fuel systems wouldn't fail, was just as important as the courage of the pilots. It was a system where factory workers, many of them women, assembling what looked like papier-mâché models, were forging the decisive weapon that would break the back of the Luftwaffe. They were building a bridge of paper and glue that would carry American air power all the way to Berlin. While the Luftwaffe was perfecting the art of the 30-minute duel, the Americans were mastering the science of the 8-hour mission. They were not seeking a silver bullet, a single technological marvel to win the war. They were preparing an industrial tsunami, a belief that any fortress could be eroded, any defense overwhelmed by a relentless, unending, and utterly disposable flood of material. A storm was gathering, and it was made not of steel, but of paper. This German confidence was not the product of fantasy. It was forged in the crucible of combat and rooted in a meticulously crafted defensive doctrine, the Reichsverteidigung, the defense of the Reich. This was no mere collection of fighter squadrons. It was a vast, intricate nervous system stretching across occupied Europe. From radar stations on the coast to command bunkers deep within Germany, officers plotted the incoming bomber streams on massive maps, acting as chess masters directing their pieces. They could predict the Americans' flight paths, calculate their fuel limits, and vector wave after wave of interceptors to strike at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability, the moment the Allied escorts were forced to turn for home. The system was brutally effective. The German fighters, the Messerschmitt Bau 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 were not all-purpose aircraft. They were thoroughbred interceptors, designed as scalpels for the single, devastating task of dissecting heavy bombers. Armed with heavy cannons and even air-to-air rockets, they were optimized for a single, overwhelming blow against their slow-moving, heavily armored prey. Their pilots were the hardened veterans of a 4-year war, masters of their craft who knew every cloud and every contour of their home skies. The catastrophic American failure at Schweinfurt was, for the Luftwaffe, the ultimate validation of this entire philosophy. On that Black Thursday, the system worked to perfection. The unescorted B-17s had flown headlong into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. The German fighter wings hit them in successive, relentless waves, overwhelming their defensive firepower and tearing the formations apart. For men like General Adolf Galland, the respected general of the fighter force, it was a professional masterpiece. He saw the Americans as brave but foolish, sacrificing their men and machines against an unbreakable defensive equation. The losses were, quite simply, unsustainable. Thus, the German High Command looked to the future with a calculated certainty. They were not ignoring the threat. They had met it and defeated it. Their analysis was sound, their experience was bloody and conclusive, and their doctrine was proven. The entire edifice of their air defense was built upon a single, immutable pillar, the iron law of logistics, which dictated that no propeller-driven fighter on Earth could escort a bomber to Berlin and back. This was not an opinion. It was a fact. And on this fact, they were willing to bet the fate of the Third Reich. In January of 1944, a change of command sent a tremor through the 8th Air Force. General James "Jimmy" Doolittle, a man whose name was synonymous with audacious long-range attacks, arrived at the headquarters in England. The atmosphere he inherited was thick with gloom. The ghosts of Schweinfurt haunted the planning rooms. The daylight bombing campaign, the cornerstone of American air strategy, was bleeding out, and many in Washington were quietly arguing to abandon it entirely. The existing doctrine of close fighter escort had failed. The fighters were leashed to the bombers like guard dogs, forced to react, always on the defensive, and always running out of fuel just when the fighting grew thickest. Doolittle was not a man built for defense. He looked at the same maps, the same intelligence reports, but saw a different reality. He saw the new P-51 Mustang, an aircraft with the legs of a marathon runner and the punch of a prize fighter, just beginning to arrive in theater. He saw the logistical reports detailing the incoming flood of disposable drop tanks, those cheap, ugly paper and glue saviors. He saw not a collection of individual technologies, but a combined weapons system whose true potential was being squandered. The change came swiftly, in a single revolutionary order that shattered years of established doctrine. In a meeting with his commanders, Doolittle listened to the familiar arguments for keeping the little friends tucked in close to the big friends. Then, he laid down the new law. The primary mission of the 8th Air Force fighters was no longer to escort the bombers. Their primary mission was to destroy the German Air Force. The bombers, he argued, were now the bait. The fighters were to be unleashed. Go out and hunt them, the order effectively stated. Seek out and destroy the enemy wherever he may be found. The shock in the room was palpable. To the bomber crews, it sounded like a death sentence, a deliberate act of abandonment. But to the fighter pilots, it was a declaration of independence. They were being unshackled from their defensive chains and turned into hunters. The bomb had been planted. From this moment on, every American bomber stream heading for Germany was no longer just a bombing raid. It was the lure for a gigantic, continent-spanning ambush. The timer had started, ticking down to the moment the Luftwaffe would rise to meet what they believed was a familiar, vulnerable prey, only to find the sky swarming with predators. Deep within the German Air Ministry in Berlin, the intelligence analysts of the Luftwaffe were engaged in a war of numbers, a conflict fought with slide rules and performance charts. They were meticulous professionals, not political ideologues. Their conclusions were based on the cold, hard evidence they painstakingly gathered. Wreckage from downed Allied aircraft, after-action reports from their own pilots, and the interrogation transcripts of captured American airmen. They knew the exact fuel capacity of a P-47 Thunderbolt. They knew the Merlin engine's rate of consumption at 25,000 feet. Their maps were covered in arcs and circles, each one representing the absolute limit of Allied fighter range. These lines were the definitive boundaries of the war. They showed with mathematical certainty that the fighter threat ended somewhere over Western Germany. Beyond this line, the Reich was a sanctuary, a hunting ground where their interceptors could operate with impunity. Early reports of the new P-51 Mustang did little to change this equation. Their data was based on the aircraft's initial Allison engine variant, a mediocre performer at high altitude which they correctly assessed as no significant threat. The reports that landed on the desks of the high command painted a picture of an enemy who was unimaginative and wasteful. The American drop tanks, when they were recovered, were seen as proof of a clumsy brute force mentality. An external tank is a crutch, one German engineering report noted, an admission that the aircraft's fundamental design is inadequate. They analyzed the primitive paper tanks with a mixture of professional scorn and cultural disdain. It was a disposable solution from a disposable culture, a sign not of ingenuity, but of a lack of true engineering elegance. This meticulous analysis led to one overarching and dangerously comforting conclusion. The enemy was relying on mass, not mastery. They were throwing waves of men and machines at a sophisticated layered defense they could not possibly break. The American daylight bombing campaign was bleeding to death, just as their calculations predicted. The intelligence proved it. The daily victories of their pilots confirmed it. The enemy was trapped in a strategic cul-de-sac, and the Luftwaffe held the only key. They were analyzing a ghost, fighting an enemy that no longer existed. But while German intelligence officers pinned charts of an obsolete aircraft to their walls, a quiet revolution was unfolding on the muddy airfields of East Anglia. The true P-51 Mustang had arrived. This was not the wheezing Allison engine disappointment the Luftwaffe had first encountered and dismissed. This was a new breed of Predator, re-engined with the superb British Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that gave the Spitfire its legendary performance. It was a thoroughbred fighter given the heart of a champion, and crucially, the legs of an endurance athlete. Those legs were being delivered by the shipload. A logistical river of paper and glue flowed from factories in Britain and America, a torrent of disposable drop tanks. One British factory alone was producing 13,000 of the 108-gallon paper tanks every single month. Under the perpetually gray English skies, ground crews worked relentlessly, uncrating these strange papery vessels and bolting them to the wings and fuselages of the newly arrived Mustangs. With two of these tanks filled to the brim, the aircraft's fuel load was more than doubled. Every tank was a one-way ticket deep into the Reich. The system was in place. The trap was set. The squadrons were practicing the new, aggressive tactics dictated by Doolittle. They were no longer bodyguards. They were wolf packs, learning to fly higher than the bombers, to use the sun, to sweep ahead and clear the skies. The Luftwaffe was meticulously preparing to fight a ghost from 1943, while a very real and far more lethal monster was gathering just across the channel. The meticulous German maps, with their confident red lines marking the end of fighter range, were now historical documents. They just didn't know it yet. In the final weeks of 1943, the question was formally posed in a Luftwaffe strategic assessment. Could the Americans ever hope to escort their bombers all the way to Berlin? The answer, after pages of meticulous calculation, was a resounding and unequivocal no. The engineers and tacticians laid out the unforgiving physics of the problem, the crippling weight of the necessary fuel, the aerodynamic drag of any conceivable external tanks, the intolerable strain on both engine and pilot over a punishing 8-hour flight. It was, they concluded, a journey into the impossible. This cold, technical conclusion was translated into political dogma by Hermann Göring. He treated the very idea with theatrical scorn, viewing it not as a potential threat, but as further evidence of a desperate and strategically bankrupt enemy. His final verdict on the matter became legendary within the high command, a statement of such absolute conviction that it silenced all further debate. An American fighter over the capital of the Reich was, he declared, a pure fantasy. The day he saw one with his own eyes, the war would be over. On the morning of March 6, 1944, the sky over England thundered with the sound of 4,000 engines. A river of steel, nearly 800 heavy bombers, lifted laboriously into the air, forming a stream that stretched for miles. But this time, something was different. Flanking them, climbing with an aggressive grace, were hundreds of P-51 Mustangs, their wings heavy with the dead weight of 150 gallons of extra fuel encased in those cheap disposable tanks. Their destination was not a factory on the coast. It was the heart of the Reich. It was Berlin. For the American pilots, this was more than a mission. It was the crossing of a psychological Rubicon. They flew past the invisible line on the map where their predecessors had always been forced to abandon their charges, pushing ever deeper into the forbidden sky. On the ground, in the German fighter control centers, the morning began with a familiar, almost comfortable routine. The plots appeared on the massive maps, a predictable intrusion into their airspace. The orders went out, fighter wings were scrambled, pilots ran to their aircraft confident in the well-rehearsed orchestrated ballet of death that would soon commence. They climbed to their assigned altitudes, anticipating the moment they would be unleashed upon the lumbering, unescorted bombers. It was a script they had performed with deadly success time and time again. Then, the first crackles of panic came through the radios. From a squadron over Brunswick, deep in central Germany, a pilot's voice, strained with disbelief. Enemy fighters, to the northwest, single engine, many of them. The reaction in the command bunker was instantaneous and dismissive. Impossible. Brunswick was 200 miles beyond the established range of any Allied escort. The controller's calm voice went out over the airwaves. Confirm your position. You must be mistaken. Identify the aircraft. The frantic reply was chilling. They are not ours. They have drop tanks. They are Mustangs. They are everywhere. This was not just a report, it was a violation of natural law. More calls flooded the channels from other squadrons, a chorus of confusion and alarm. The men on the ground, trusting their charts and their doctrines, dismissed it as a mass delusion, a case of pilot hysteria in the fog of war. A senior officer, looking at the unwavering red line on his map, made a fateful decision. He logged the reports as unconfirmed anomalies. He trusted the physics. He did not trust the terrified voices of his own men. But high above, in the cold, thin air, the impossible was happening. The American fighter pilots, having escorted the bombers to their target, jettisoned their now empty paper tanks. Hundreds of these papery shells tumbled through the Skase, a silver rain of industrial defiance glinting in the sun. The Mustangs were now light, clean, and full of their own internal fuel. The bombers had done their job. They had been the bait. Now, as the first waves of the Luftwaffe climbed to meet them, the hunters were circling above, waiting. The trap was about to spring. For Major Klaus Richter, a 20 victory ace leading a squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s, the climb to 30,000 feet was a familiar ritual. Below him, the vast silvery snake of the American bomber stream crawled towards Berlin. His orders, relayed from the ground, were simple: engage and destroy. He scanned the sky above the bombers, a reflexive, professional habit. It was empty. As expected, the American little friends would have turned for home long ago, their fuel tanks running dry. This was his sky now, his hunting ground. The bombers were lambs, and the wolves were climbing to the feast. Then he saw them, tiny, sun-glinting specks, impossibly high above the B-17s. Another German fighter group, he assumed, moving into a higher attack position. His radio remained calm, the ground controllers orchestrating the intercept with their usual precision. But the specks were not behaving like German fighters. They weren't forming up, they were circling, patient and predatory. And then, as Richter's squadron began to position itself for the attack, they dove. It was not a coordinated, disciplined German assault. It was an avalanche of silver predators plummeting out of the sun. In the space of 10 seconds, the world tilted on its axis. The clear, orderly sky erupted into a maelstrom of chaos. The unmistakable shapes of Mustangs, with their long noses and bubble canopies, flashed past his cockpit. Tracers from 50 caliber machine guns, 8 per plane, stitched fiery lines through the air. The German radio, moments before a tool of calm command, became a cacophony of screams and warnings. Mustangs, above us. They are everywhere. Pilots who were seconds from attacking bombers found themselves fighting for their own lives, caught in a defensive struggle they never anticipated. Their heavy interceptors, laden with cannons and rockets for killing bombers, were sluggish and unresponsive against these nimble, aggressive dogfighters. The German pilots had been trained to fight bombers. They had perfected the art of the head-on pass, the devastating dive from above. But they had not been trained for this. They were the ambushers, the hunters. The idea that they themselves could be ambushed deep within their own airspace was not just tactically shocking, it was a psychological violation. The entire foundation of their air defense, the very logic of their war, was being shredded in real time by an enemy who simply wasn't supposed to be there. And then came the final, soul-crushing confirmation. As the American fighters engaged, the pilots witnessed a sight that would haunt their reports and their nightmares. A cascade of silver and white teardrops fell away from the Mustang's wings, hundreds of empty drop tanks, jettisoned now that their work was done. It was the physical evidence of the impossible, a rain of industrial contempt falling upon the heart of the Reich. Each one was a testament to Germany's fatal miscalculation. The invisible wall of fuel and distance had not just been breached, it had been contemptuously dismantled and discarded before their very eyes. The sanctuary was gone. The war had come home. In the subterranean heart of the Berlin Fighter Control Center, nicknamed the Glass Palace, the war was an abstract art. On a vast illuminated map of Northern Europe, women of the Luftwaffe Helferinnen Corps moved wooden markers representing friendly and enemy formations with calm precision. Here, Oberleutnant Dieter Frank orchestrated the defense. He was a master of this deadly game, a conductor leading a symphony of coordinated destruction. He knew the notes by heart, the speed of a B-17, the fuel endurance of a P-47, the exact moment to unleash his interceptors for maximum effect. On the morning of March 6th, the symphony began as it always did. The enemy markers crept across the map. The friendly markers rose to meet them. The first dissonant note came from a seasoned wing commander, his voice tight but professional over the radio. He reported enemy fighters 100 miles west of the capital. Frank, without looking up from the board, corrected him. Impossible. His charts, his physics, his entire reality dictated that the enemy fighters were long gone, racing for home on fumes. "Reconfirm," Frank ordered, his voice laced with the slight annoyance of a master correcting a student. "You are likely seeing the Focke-Wulfs from Squadron JG-3. Moments later, another voice, this one higher-pitched, laced with a growing panic, broke through the static from a different sector. Enemy fighters, Mustangs, directly above the bomber stream. Now, a ripple of unease passed through the control room. 2 veteran pilots separated by miles reporting the same phantom. Frank held firm. It was a classic case of misidentification in the high-altitude glare. He broadcast a general message, his tone a stern command to restore order. "All units, be advised, there are no enemy fighters in your sector. The aircraft are friendly. I repeat, the aircraft are friendly." The response that came back was not a report. It was a cry of pure existential shock that seared itself into the memory of everyone who heard it. It was the wing commander's voice again, but all professional composure was gone. It was raw, naked, and utterly terrified. "They are not friendly. They are Mustangs, and they have drop tanks. Sweet God, they have drop tanks." A profound silence fell over the Glass Palace. The confident chatter of the controllers ceased. The graceful movements of the plotters froze. Every single person in that room understood the catastrophic implication of those 3 words. They have drop tanks. It was the sound of their entire world breaking. The charts on the walls were lies. The doctrines in their manuals were fantasies. The invisible wall that had protected them for 4 years had just been proven to be a ghost. The map, moments before a tool of command, was now a useless piece of furniture. It depicted a war that no longer existed. That radio transmission became a legend in the Luftwaffe, a whispered epitaph for the moment of their breaking. It was the story of the day the chess masters in Berlin realized that their opponent had knocked over the board and was now strangling them with the pieces. For Oberleutnant Frank and the men and women in that bunker, the abstract war of symbols and plots was over. The real war, a war they could not possibly win, had just begun, 30,000 feet above their heads. The shock that paralyzed the German command was not an emotion, it was a belated encounter with arithmetic. The numbers behind the Berlin raid were a brutal refutation of everything they believed to be true. The North American P-51 Mustang, with its internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons, was a capable fighter. But when fitted with two 108-gallon drop tanks, its total fuel load swelled to over 400 gallons. This didn't just extend its range, it created a new strategic reality. Its combat radius leaped to over 850 miles, transforming it from a short-range bodyguard into a continental predator. For comparison, the Luftwaffe's premier interceptor, the Bf-109G, struggled to reach a combat radius of 400 miles. The mathematics were brutal and they were undeniable. But the true weapon was not the single aircraft, it was the system that produced it. During the war, American factories would build over 15,000 Mustangs, and the drop tanks, the cheap disposable keys that unlocked the Mustang's potential. They were produced on a scale that defied German comprehension. A single factory in Great Britain, using non-strategic paper and glue, could assemble 13,000 of them in a single month. This was not a weapon system. It was an industrial avalanche, a belief that any problem could be solved by burying it under a mountain of mass-produced expendable hardware. This was economic warfare disguised as aerial combat. Each paper tank cost the Allies roughly $25. A comparable German tank, carefully crafted from precious rationed aluminum, cost 10 times as much and was intended to be recovered and reused. The Americans had created a weapon that was cheaper for them to throw away than it was for the Germans to build. The silver rain of jettisoned tanks that Luftwaffe pilots witnessed was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a terrifyingly visible symbol of an economic equation that had already doomed them. They were fighting not just an air force, but a philosophy of infinite disposable power. The catastrophe that unfolded over Berlin was not simply a failure of intelligence, it was the violent collision of two irreconcilable philosophies of war. The German system, the Reichsverteidigung, was a watchmaker's masterpiece. It was a symphony of defense, intricate, precise, and reactive. It was designed to parry a blow. Its aircraft, the Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, were thoroughbreds, optimized for the short, brutal sprint of interception. Every component was a testament to a culture of engineering perfectionism, a belief that victory was achieved through superior quality and the masterful skill of the individual ace. Their very worldview saw war as an equation of quality, where one elegant solution would always triumph over 1,000 clumsy ones. The American system, by contrast, was an industrial bludgeon. It was not elegant, it was overwhelming. It was not reactive, it was relentless. It was a system designed not to parry a blow, but to deliver so many, from so many directions, that the opponent simply disintegrated under the strain. The P-51 Mustang was not necessarily a more perfect machine than its German counterparts in every respect, but it was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It was good enough at everything, and it was attached to a logistical pipeline of almost infinite capacity. Its decisive weapon was not its cannons or its engine, but the disposable paper tank that embodied a worldview utterly alien to the German mindset, the belief that disposability was a strategic asset. This chasm in thinking was laid bare in the skies. The German doctrine was predicated on control. Their pilots were chess pieces, moved by masters on the ground to intercept a predictable threat at a chosen time and place. They were the spiders, and the Reich was their web. Jimmy Doolittle's new doctrine tore that web to shreds. By turning the bombers into bait and unleashing the fighters, he robbed the Germans of the one thing their system could not function without: control. The American fighters were now the aggressors, the hunters who dictated the terms of the fight. The Luftwaffe was caught in a fatal dilemma. Their duty, their entire purpose, was to attack the bombers threatening their cities. But to do so now meant they had to fly directly into the jaws of the waiting Mustang wolf packs. They were forced to fight a battle they hadn't planned for, in a place they didn't choose, against an enemy whose very presence defied their understanding of the war. They had built the perfect sword to slay a lumbering giant, only to find the giant was now guarded by a swarm of tireless, venomous hornets. This was the deep philosophical reason for the disaster. The Luftwaffe's defeat was not a failure of courage, nor a simple lack of resources. It was a failure of imagination. They had prepared for a duel of champions and found themselves instead drowned by an indifferent, featureless industrial tide. It was the final, brutal confrontation between the 19th century ideal of the knightly warrior and the stark 20th century reality of total, mechanized, mass-produced war. In the days following the March 6th raid, a cold dread began to seep through the corridors of the Air Ministry in Berlin. The initial chaotic reports from the front had now been compiled, cross-referenced, and laid out on the massive conference tables. They were no longer just a collection of pilot anecdotes. They were a river of damning evidence, a statistical autopsy of a massacre. The numbers of German fighters lost were grievous, but it was the map, dotted with the locations of the dogfights, that told the truly terrifying story. The engagements had not occurred over the coast or in Western Germany. They had been fought over Brunswick, over Magdeburg, in the skies directly above the approaches to the capital. The sanctuary was gone. It fell to General Adolf Galland to deliver the formal post-mortem to Hermann Göring and his staff. Galland, the general of the fighter force, was a soldier, not a courtier. He arrived with a sheaf of reports, his face a mask of grim professionalism. He spoke without emotion, laying out the facts in a cold, precise litany of failure. He detailed the timing of the attacks, the altitudes of the engagements, and the overwhelming testimony of his pilots. The enemy fighters had not been a fluke, not a handful of specially modified reconnaissance planes. They had been there in force, operating with an aggressive, coordinated doctrine that his men were completely unprepared for. Göring's initial reaction was a volcanic eruption of denial and rage. It was an attack on his prestige, on his very identity as the creator of the Luftwaffe. He slammed his fist on the table, his face purpling. Lies, excuses, he bellowed. "Your pilots are cowards. They are seeing ghosts to cover for their incompetence." He accused Galland of protecting a fighter force that had lost its nerve, of believing the panicked fantasies of young pilots over the strategic certainties that had guided them for years. For a tense moment, the entire edifice of German air power rested on this single, furious refusal to see the truth. But Galland was unflinching. He waited for the Reichsmarshal's tirade to subside, then calmly presented his final, irrefutable piece of evidence. He had a photograph and a field intelligence report of one of the jettisoned American drop tanks. It had been recovered from a farmer's field east of the Elbe River. It was made of paper. "This is not a ghost, Herr Reichsmarschall," Galland stated, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute finality. "This is the weapon that has defeated us. It is cheap, it is disposable, and it has given their Mustangs the legs to walk all the way to your front door. Every defensive calculation we have ever made is now obsolete. The war in the air has been fundamentally and irrevocably changed." A heavy silence descended upon the room. The bluster and rage drained from Göring's face, replaced by a gray, slack-jawed comprehension. He stared at the photograph of the crude paper tank, this absurdly simple piece of garbage that had just dismantled his invincible air force. The map on the wall, with its proud emblems marking the victorious fighter wings of the Reich, no longer looked like a symbol of power. It looked like a tombstone. The world had collapsed. The impossible had happened. And everyone in that room, from the Reichsmarschall down to the junior aides, knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The true horror for the German High Command began to sink in only after the initial shock of the Berlin raid had passed. The problem was not that a single, specially modified American fighter had reached the capital. The problem was that the raid had not been a daring, one-time stunt. It had been a routine, large-scale operation. It was a casual demonstration of a capability they now possessed in depth. The door had not been picked, it had been kicked off its hinges. And now, the question that hung in the air of every planning session was not how did they do it, but how many more are coming tomorrow. The answer lay in a set of intelligence reports that had been previously dismissed as Allied propaganda. Reports from places like Willow Run, Michigan, where the Ford Motor Company had built a factory a mile long, from which a new B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes. They read about shipyards where entire fleets were being built faster than they could be sunk. It was a scale of production that was not just larger than their own. It was a different species of industrial activity altogether. German industry was a finely tuned instrument, a collection of master craftsmen building exquisite war machines. American industry was a volcano, spewing forth an unending, indiscriminate river of steel. This was the context in which they now saw the humble paper drop tank. It was no longer just a clever technical solution, it was a profound cultural insult. German engineers who examined the recovered examples could barely contain their contempt and their terror. They saw the sloppy gluing, the cheap paper, the crude fittings. It was an object devoid of all craftsmanship, of all pride. It was trash. And yet this mass-produced piece of trash had just rendered their entire billion Reichsmark air defense system obsolete. The Americans were not just waging war, they were littering it, casually discarding the very tools of their victory because it was easier to make new ones than to conserve the old. The German generals, men who had built their careers on the art of the decisive battle, the Kesselschlacht, were now faced with the brutal arithmetic of a war of attrition they could not possibly win. They could calculate the kill ratios. Their aces, flying their superior interceptors, might well shoot down 2, 3, or even 5 Mustangs for every Messerschmitt they lost. But it was a meaningless victory. For every Mustang that fell, 10 more were being loaded onto a freighter in a New York harbor. For every ace they lost, the Americans had 100 fresh pilots, trained in the safety of their own continent, waiting to take his place. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting an entire civilization geared for total, overwhelming war. They were trying to build a dam of masterful engineering and tactical brilliance against an industrial tsunami. The individual skill of their pilots, the superior muzzle velocity of their cannons, the proud traditions of their air force, all of it was being rendered terrifyingly irrelevant. The decisive battles of the air war, they now realized, were not being fought at 30,000 feet over Berlin. They were being fought and won on the assembly lines of Detroit. It was a competition of economies, and Germany had already lost. The aftermath of the spring of 1944 brought a new, chilling clarity to the Luftwaffe's internal communications. The bluster and arrogance of the previous year evaporated, replaced by a tone of grim, almost fatalistic realism. The most powerful evidence of this psychological collapse came from the two men who had been the twin pillars of the German air war. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, the political master, and General Adolf Galland, the soldier's soldier. Their admissions, spoken in moments of private despair, serve as the definitive epitaph for the Luftwaffe's defeat. It was Galland, in a tense meeting with Göring and Hitler, who first gave voice to the unthinkable. After weeks of watching his fighter force be systematically bled dry by the relentless American offensive, he was asked what he needed to turn the tide. He looked directly at the Reichsmarshal, the man who had promised that no enemy bomb would ever fall on Germany, and delivered his now legendary reply. He did not ask for more cannons, more powerful engines, or even the new jet fighters. "What I need," Galland stated, his voice heavy with the bitterness of a lost war, "is a squadron of Spitfires." It was the ultimate professional tribute, a soldier's admission that the enemy's basic tools were now superior to his own. But the most haunting confession came from Göring himself. The man who had once dismissed American industry as a maker of razor blades and refrigerators now found himself a prisoner of its terrifying power. His boast about changing his name to Meyer if a single bomber reached the Ruhr had become a national joke. But there was no humor left in the spring of 1944. In a moment of unguarded honesty, speaking with Galland as they watched the contrails of another massive American raid scar the skies over Germany, the Reichsmarshal's theatrical facade finally crumbled. He pointed a shaking finger at the sky, at the high-altitude silver glint of the escorting fighters. "When I saw the Mustangs over Berlin," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, "I knew the jig was up." This was more than an admission of tactical defeat. It was the complete and total surrender of a worldview. It was the voice of a man who had built an empire on a myth of technological and spiritual superiority, now staring at the undeniable physical proof of its utter collapse. It was the final, devastating verdict, delivered not by the enemy, but by the vanquished. The war in the air was over, and its architects were the first to know it. Faced with a war of attrition they could no longer win, the German High Command did what dying empires have always done. They turned to the promise of a miracle. They sought a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon that could tear up the existing rulebook and reset the terms of engagement. That miracle had a name: the Messerschmitt Me 262. It was the world's first operational jet fighter, a technological ghost from the future. With a top speed over 100 miles per hour faster than the Mustang, armed with 4 devastating 30mm cannons, it was an angel of death. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was untouchable. It was the perfect, elegant German solution, a scalpel designed to operate in a slaughterhouse. But a miracle weapon cannot be willed into existence. It must be built. And the industrial ecosystem required to produce this jet-powered savior was itself the primary target of the Allied bombing offensive. The very factories in Bavaria and Thuringia designated to assemble the Me-262 were being systematically pounded into rubble by the waves of B-17s, all of them now safely chaperoned by the omnipresent P-51s. Engine production was crippled by a lack of chromium and nickel. Fuel supplies dwindled. The Germans had designed the perfect cure, but the patient's body was dying too quickly to administer it. Their solution was being strangled at birth by the very problem it was meant to solve. Compounding the logistical nightmare was a strategic civil war. Adolf Galland and the fighter pilots saw the Me-262 for what it was: the ultimate defensive interceptor, the one weapon that could smash the American bomber formations and reclaim the skies. But Hitler, in the grip of a vengeful fury, saw something else. He demanded the jet be converted into a blitz bomber, a high-speed tactical bomber to strike back at the Allies on the ground. This order, a catastrophic misunderstanding of the aircraft's strengths, created chaos, delayed production, and squandered the jet's potential. While the Americans operated under Doolittle's single, brutally simple doctrine, destroy the Luftwaffe, the Germans were paralyzed by indecision, fighting over the soul of their only hope. Even when the jets did reach the front lines, in terrifyingly small numbers, the final irony revealed itself. In the air, at speed, they were gods. But they were gods with a fatal flaw. The jet engines were fragile and slow to respond, making the Me-262 a clumsy, vulnerable target during its long takeoff runs and landing approaches. The American Mustang pilots, masters of the new predatory war, quickly adapted. They stopped trying to fight the jets at 30,000 feet and instead began to rat-catch them near their own airfields, circling like vultures, waiting to pounce on the jets when they were at their most helpless. The attempt to counter the Allied strategy had failed completely. The Me-262 was not a failed aircraft. It was a brilliant machine born into a collapsing system. The Germans' desperate lunge for a technological trump card was parried and defeated by the enemy's relentless, grinding, and fundamentally more cohesive strategy. They had tried to leapfrog the enemy with a single brilliant weapon, but in doing so, they only proved how far behind they had truly fallen. The final act of resistance was not a glorious last stand, but a tragic and futile spectacle of a superior weapon being methodically dismantled by a superior system. The greatest damage inflicted by the long-range Mustang was not to the factories of the Reich or to the fighter wings of the Luftwaffe. The deepest wound was ideological. The P-51 and the humble paper tank that gave it its reach served as a piece of psychological shrapnel that lodged itself in the very heart of the National Socialist mythos. For 12 years, the regime had been built on a carefully constructed trinity of superiority: the superiority of German engineering, the superiority of the German warrior, and the absolute divinely ordained security of the German homeland. In the spring of 1944, this entire edifice of belief was systematically dismantled. The myth of technological supremacy was the first to die. German propaganda had elevated the engineer to a priestly status, and his creations, the Tiger tank, the U-boat, the Focke-Wulf fighter, were held up as icons of an innate national genius. The American victory, therefore, was a profound cultural humiliation because it was so deliberately, so contemptuously, ugly. The decisive weapon was not a more elegant machine, but a crude, disposable paper cone filled with gasoline. It was a victory of the assembly line over the craftsman's workshop, of brute force pragmatism over engineering perfectionism. It suggested that the German obsession with quality was, in the end, a fatal weakness. Next to Crumble was the myth of the Aryan warrior. The Luftwaffe ace was the modern incarnation of the Teutonic Knight, a hero celebrated on posters and in newsreels. He was portrayed as an individual Superman whose innate skill and fighting spirit would always triumph. But the new American doctrine of overwhelming numbers rendered this romantic ideal obsolete. The German pilot was no longer a knight seeking a glorious duel. He was a fireman rushing into an inferno. He was being hunted, ground down, and exterminated by a faceless, unending swarm of enemies. The war in the sky ceased to be a test of individual valor and became a grim, impersonal, industrial process of attrition. The hero had become a statistic. And so, when the Mustangs finally appeared over Berlin, it was the death blow to the final and most important myth of all, the invincibility of the Reich. This was not just a tactical failure, it was a broken promise, a spiritual betrayal. The silver glint of an American fighter in the skies over the capital was a message broadcast to every citizen on the ground that their leaders had failed them, their technology was not supreme, and their warriors were not invincible. It hollowed out the regime's claim to legitimacy from within, replacing faith with fear and confidence with a creeping, corrosive doubt. The physical war would drag on for another year, but the moral war, the war for the soul of the German people, was lost. In the moment a pilot looked up and saw the impossible circling over his head. The doctrinal earthquake triggered by the long-range Mustang raids of 1944 sent shockwaves that reshaped the entire landscape of modern warfare. The most immediate and brutal lesson was carved into the strategic manuals of every air force on the planet. The age of the unescorted heavy bomber was over, forever. The principle of air superiority was no longer a desirable objective. It was now the absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite for any successful military operation on the ground, at sea, or in the air. This single lesson, paid for in the blood of thousands of airmen, would dictate the design of aircraft and the structure of armies for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The P-51's mission created the genetic code for the modern air superiority fighter. The idea of a short-range defensive interceptor, the pride of the pre-war Luftwaffe, became an anachronism. The new paradigm demanded fighters that were not just fast and agile, but possessed the endurance to penetrate deep into enemy territory, hunt the enemy in his own lair, and establish dominance over the battlefield. From the F-86 Sabres that swept the skies over Korea to the F-15 Eagles that patrolled the deserts of Iraq, every premier Western fighter has been a direct philosophical descendant of the Mustang, an aircraft designed not just to defend, but to reach out and project power. Doolittle's hunter ethos became the central creed of the modern fighter pilot. On the grand geopolitical chessboard, this newfound capability for long-range power projection became the cornerstone of America's post-war identity. The ability to escort a bomber to Berlin was the proof of concept for a strategy of global reach. It was the birth of a military posture that could hold any target on the planet at risk, a capability that would define the Cold War. The Strategic Air Command, with its fleets of intercontinental bombers, was built upon the operational lessons learned in the skies over Germany. The entire American doctrine of containment and nuclear deterrence rested on this proven ability to project overwhelming force across vast distances, a direct legacy of those first terrifying raids into the heart of the Reich. But perhaps the most surprising and pervasive legacy of this victory was not military or political, but cultural. The humble paper drop tank was the ultimate symbol of the weapon of abundance, and in the post-war years, that weapon came home. The same industrial philosophy that found it more efficient to discard a fuel tank than to recover it became the engine of American consumer society. The ethos of disposability, of mass production on a scale that makes individual items cheap enough to throw away, bled from the military-industrial complex into every aspect of civilian life. The logic that built the paper tank was the same logic that would later build the disposable razor, the plastic container, and the culture of repair by replacement. In a strange and profound way, The strategy that defeated the Third Reich also laid the foundation for the throwaway society of the 21st century. Thus, the events of 1944 did far more than decide the air war. They established the military doctrines that would govern the Cold War, defined the technological path of the modern fighter jet, and unleashed a philosophy of mass-produced abundance that would go on to remake the world in America's image. The simple, ugly solution to a complex tactical problem ended up redrawing the map of the future. And so, we arrive at the central, immutable lesson of this entire conflict, an aphorism forged in the skies over the Third Reich. In the mathematics of modern war, perfection is the enemy of good enough, especially when good enough arrives by the thousands. The Luftwaffe was defeated not because the Messerschmitt was an inferior machine to the Mustang, but because it was part of an inferior system. The German war effort was a quest for the perfect weapon. The American war effort was a quest for the perfect assembly line. And in the end, the assembly line will always win. This was a war fought between two different centuries. The Luftwaffe was fighting a war of champions, a modern echo of the knightly duels of a bygone era, predicated on the superior skill of the individual ace and the exquisite quality of his steed. They were defeated by an opponent who refused to duel, an opponent who understood that the future of warfare was not a contest of heroes, but a brutal, impersonal audit of industrial capacity. The paper drop tank was the ultimate expression of this new reality. It was a declaration that the power of disposable abundance will always, eventually, overwhelm the fragility of hoarded perfection. Ultimately, this is a story about the catastrophic failure of imagination. The German High Command, blinded by its own mythology of engineering excellence and martial spirit, could not conceive of a philosophy of war so pragmatic, so unromantic, and so devastatingly effective. Their greatest miscalculation was not technical, but psychological. They prepared meticulously for a war against a mirror image of themselves, and were consumed by an enemy who refused to reflect their values, an enemy who had already understood the simple, terrifying secret of 20th century power. In the final twilight months of the war, the last of Germany's miracle weapons sat idle on cratered airfields. The Me-262 jets, machines that could have been kings of the sky, were grounded. They were grounded by a lack of fuel, by a lack of trained pilots, and by the constant predatory presence of American fighters circling overhead, waiting for them to make their slow, vulnerable ascent. The sky over the Reich no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. It was a foreign, hostile territory, a ceiling of enemy air power pressing down on the last embers of a dying empire. The wonder weapon had arrived, but the war had already been lost. There is no more fitting epitaph for this collapse than the words of the man who commanded the fighter pilots, General Adolf Galland. In his post-war memoirs, looking back with the cold clarity of a defeated professional, he stripped away all the politics and propaganda to identify the single, mortal wound from which his Air Force had bled to death. His was not the voice of a bitter ideologue, but of a soldier offering his final, unvarnished after-action report on the death of his own command. The P-51, Galland wrote, was the death knell of the Luftwaffe. He spoke of the Me-262 with a professional's sorrow, a tragic admiration for a beautiful and potent weapon that was born into a world already lost. The Me-262 was our only hope, he concluded, and it came too late. In this simple, haunting admission, the entire story is told. It is the final, irrefutable verdict delivered by the last champion of a vanquished philosophy, acknowledging the crude paper and glue key that had unlocked his fortress and brought his world crashing down.